And so after quite a wonderful pilgrimage of 10 days in the Holy Land and being immersed into the mother culture and the mother faith that we all spring forth from, there's an interesting play in names that we hear in the Old Testament. And one thing that came up often and as we traveled and visited the biblical places were names and what they meant. In Hebrew, names mean something, and a lot of times in America, our names don't mean anything. But names do have a significance in there. And so, if we recall, we're hearing here the story of Ishmael and Abraham and how he takes on that call to follow God into what is the promised land. The names themselves have a certain significance. We know that a lot of times names change in the Bible. And so Abraham originally was Abram, and later God changes Abraham's name to Abraham. Abram, or the original name that Abraham had, meant exalted father or excellent father. And if we've been following Genesis from the beginning, we know that Abraham himself, or Abram, before God changed his name, wasn't just a solitary voyager, wasn't just some lone guy that gets called by God and takes off by himself. No, he was rather a wealthy man. We know he had herds of goats and animals, he had slaves, he had a large family, he had a great retinue that was with him. Abraham, as he was known, was a just man. He was what we'd probably call him magnate today. And thus is what the word Abram means in Hebrew. However, after encountering God and after a fundamental experience of God, God changes his name, changes it to Abraham. And what does that ha mean in there? The father of many. And so from being the excellent or the exalted father, el gran papi in a certain way, now he becomes the father of many. And we know the promise that God makes to him, to be the father of many nations. However, Abraham has two sons, and we hear about the first one today, whose story and whose significance kind of gets lost in the scriptures because this is all we hear about him. We know that Abraham, as he was nearing older age and didn't have his own son, the custom at that time was for the wife to procure someone else to basically have a surrogate, to have a surrogate child for him. And so his slave, Hagar, gave birth to his son, which he named Ishmael. We only hear about Ishmael just briefly here, that Ishmael begins to play with Abraham's natural son, Isaac, and the mother gets jealous. And so Sarah orders and has him dismiss this slave and her child away so that, all the attention and all the inheritance could go to the natural born son. And so I was instigated to find out what's the name of Ishmael and what does it mean. El, at the end, we know, especially in Hebrew, El means the Lord. So anything that has El in there means the Lord. Ishmael means the Lord will hear. And think about how that becomes significant. Ishmael, the Lord who hears Abraham's desire for a son, for a continuance. If he was this magnate, this big daddy of sorts, but had no son, there was certainly a petition that was unheard or needed to be heard. And Ishmael was that answer. One thing that gets lost also in the Bible, or at least in our reading of it, is time. If Ishmael was a small child playing with a baby, Ishmael had probably been around for several years already. Must have been a sort of small kid, probably past a toddler. Maybe he was 4 or 5 years old by then. Ishmael would have known his father, would have known Abraham, would have been raised by Abraham. And obviously his mother, Hagar, would have enjoyed a certain position in that household. It's not until recently that we see that Sarah gives birth to Isaac, Abraham's natural son with his wife. And so if this older Ishmael was playing with the toddler or a child to Isaac. You can see probably this happened months before, or maybe just a year before. What does the word Isaac mean? Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. And remember, that was what Sarah had done when she heard that she would bear a child in old age. She laughed. She thought it was impossible, and yet Isaac was born. And so that laughter brought life. Ishmael, God who will hear, and Isaac, who is laughter. The story of Ishmael gets lost. Again, we just hear about that Hagar, the mother, and Ishmael go off to the desert, and he's about to die. He's been abandoned. He's been refuted. He's been kicked out, so to say, from his household. But the Lord hears again, as is the name Ishmael what it means. The Lord will hear. And the Lord hears the mother's anguish, probably hears the child's anguish as well. They who are about to die of thirst, who are abandoned, who have no more livelihood, God hears them. And what we know is that the descendants will go and bear a great nation. We don't hear anything else about who this nation is. In the Muslim tradition, they say, well, that's where Muhammad comes from. And the Muslims are the sons of Ishmael. They're the other nation that comes in. But what we can take from here, in this reading from the Old Testament, is that God does not abandon even those who are most destitute. God will hear our cry. God will see us in our distress and will not abandon us. Water, a well, appears to the mother and to Ishmael. And later, the promise of a nation would also go on. That inheritance that was promised to Abraham and his offspring would not be denied to Ishmael either. God does not abandon. Through no fault of Ishmael in the conditions that he was born, he would not be penalized for it. Isaac, we see, means laughter, and Isaac gives birth to a son who's called Jacob. Yaqub in Hebrew means to follow or the one who overcomes. We know Jacob is the one who wrestles with the angel. And if the angel is the presence of God and the messenger of God, is the one who wrestles with God, but is overcome by the angel. After that encounter, Jacob's name is changed, and they change it to Israel. That's the father of the nation. Israel has that word El at the end, which means God perseveres. God will see it through. God will be there to the end. Jacob, or Israel, has a new name after that encounter with God. Abraham has a new name after his encounter with God. When one encounters God, we see there's a change of name. To think about it, we kind of do the same thing in our baptism. That's the day we formally receive our name. It's the first question that is asked at the baptismal font. What name do you give this child? Because that encounter with God is the one that gives us our identity and our name. We have the custom, although it's falling, it's kind of disappearing little by little, at confirmation to take a confirmation name. Why? Because that's a definitive encounter with God in the completion of that baptismal promise of the Holy Spirit. And so our name is changed. And previously, and again, the practice has completely fallen off now, but in religious life, many times when one takes vows to enter a religious order, one would take on a religious name as well, would change their name, although now it's rarely heard of. Might be why you're here, and if you look back at 100 years or 80 years ago, why so many Jesuits would have the name Ignacio or Aloysius or the names of these saints. Well, it wasn't by coincidence that they were born that way, but they took the name upon taking their vows. When God intervenes in our life in an irreversible way, that is marked by the change in the name. It's kind of the way we get nicknames. When something happens, when we go through something with our friends, well, we get christened with a new name, that nickname. says in the military, many times you might change your call sign or your nickname as things happen, and as you serve in different units, your nickname might change. But it's because something has happened. That common experience changes us, changes who we are and our identity, not only how we see ourselves, but how others see us. And may our names, or especially those names that we took at our baptism, remain that mark of that unchangeable, of that irreversible encounter with our God. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.